That worn-out military uniform makes you think you're still a hero? That was the direct insult a police officer hurled at the old man before cuffing him right there in the street. He laughed when the man didn't resist. But what he didn't expect was this. Just 30 minutes later, 3 FBI agents showed up with a warrant to investigate the entire department. Now, social media is dragging every single name in that precinct, and everyone's asking the same chilling question. How many medals have been buried under the arrogance of power-abusing cops? The sun hadn't reached its peak yet, but the heat on Lincoln Square already pressed down like a loaded verdict. A few pigeons scattered as the patrol car screeched to a stop, diagonally blocking the crosswalk. Officer Taylor stepped out, sunglasses still on, his gaze sharp like a man scanning for a fight, not enforcing the peace. And there he was, an old black man, slow but upright, a weathered wooden cane guiding each step. He didn't wobble. He didn't beg. He walked like someone who had survived more than most could name. "Hey, Grandpa!" Taylor barked, loud enough to turn heads from benches and coffee carts. The man paused. His expression didn't change. He simply looked up, eyes steady. Taylor sneered, stepped closer. "Special forces at your age? What was it? Combat knitting? Bet you run operations in the nursing home now, huh?" A few bystanders chuckled nervously, but the old man didn't flinch. He raised one brow. "You finished, son?" Wrong answer. Taylor grabbed the man's wrist and twisted it behind his back. The pop was audible before the cuffs clicked. The old man's knees buckled slightly, but he didn't make a sound. Not when the steel bit in, not even when blood began to bead around his wrist. "Comply or you'll hit the ground," Taylor hissed. "Resisting arrest? For what?" someone shouted. "Walking?" Taylor ignored it. His boot slammed down. A sharp crack echoed as the cane split in two, half of it flying into the gutter. The old man stared down at the broken wood like it was a spine. Across the square, a woman's voice rang out, cracked but clear. "He saved my son in Iraq." It came from an elderly woman gripping a tote bag with trembling fingers. Her hair was white, her eyes wide with fury. Taylor turned to her. "Ma'am, step back. You're interfering with a lawful detention." "That man is a hero, you bastard," she yelled. "You wouldn't know courage if it—" "Step back, or you're next." Taylor's hand hovered near his taser. The threat was clear. She stopped but didn't back down. Her voice trembled now, not from fear but fury long held. At the corner, a rookie officer, badge still gleaming, eyes too young, moved a half step forward. "Sir," he said to Taylor, "maybe we should de-escalate. This is—" "Say one more word and you're off this detail," Taylor snapped. "You want to write parking tickets for the rest of your life?" The rookie froze, jaw clenched. He looked at the man in cuffs. Blood still ran in thin lines down the elder's fingers. One drop hit the pavement. The crowd grew, silent but present. Some were filmed with shaky phones. Others just watched, disbelief in their eyes, like they'd seen a monument desecrated. High above, the city's security camera caught it all. The cuffs, the kick, the woman's scream, the silence that followed. But in the control room, a flicker. A sudden blackout. The feed went gray. Technical fault. Someone would write in a log later. No explanation, no recovery. Just a dead signal where truth had once lived. And Officer Taylor, smug and satisfied, dragged the old man to the back of the patrol car. The cane lay broken on the sidewalk, soaked not just in blood, but in memory. A weapon once used for walking, for standing tall, now reduced to shards by a man who thought the badge gave him more honor than the one he'd just crushed underfoot. No one helped him up. Not one hand reached out to wipe the blood. The shame wasn't in what Taylor did, it was in what the others didn't. An old man with nothing but silence in his pocket stood taller than the officers with radios on their belts. The woman with white hair whispered his name, but it was too soft. Her voice cracked like the cane. A child in the crowd tugged his mother's coat and asked, "Why did they hurt Grandpa?" No answer came, because nothing would make sense until someone said it out loud. A history of service crushed by a single step. A whole life collapsed into a pool of red where dignity bled freely, unnoticed by the law that swore to protect it. On the wall inside the precinct, a plaque listed fallen officers, but no wall bore the names of those they broke. The footage, later deleted, became a ghost in the department. People knew it existed, they whispered about it. A few staff tried to recover it, but were warned, disobey and face reassignment. So, it vanished, like justice does when it becomes inconvenient. And Taylor, he drove on, radio static in his ear, his hands gripping the wheel like nothing had happened. But something had, not just to the man, to the town, to the people who saw it and chose not to speak. The square would never look the same again, not after blood darkened the sidewalk, not after silence screamed louder than sirens, not after one man with no weapon became the sharpest mirror a town could face. That day, a cane broke, but it wasn't the only thing. Something else snapped. The illusion that brutality was an accident. The lie that silence was neutral. The hope that justice had good timing. And in that crack, history echoed. The square hadn't even emptied when it started. A student, barely 16, had been filming the whole time. Her hand shaky, but her instinct dead on. No edits. No filters. Just 16 seconds of raw, gut-punch truth. She uploaded the clip straight from her phone, captioned with a single line, "This is what respect looks like to them." By the time she left the plaza, it had already hit 3,000 views. 16 seconds. That's all it took to tear off the mask. It opened with the cane snapping like dry bone under Taylor's boot, then caught the old man's eyes, dark, steady, unwavering, even as blood traced down his wrist. In the background, someone screamed, "He's a former Special Forces. He's got a Ranger tab." The voice cracked, but the camera caught it, froze it, preserved it, and Taylor's voice, sickeningly smug, cut across, louder, deliberate. "Doesn't matter what he used to be. He's nothing now." That sentence turned the match into a wildfire. Someone paused the video at the 8-second mark and zoomed in on the man's chest. His jacket opened slightly, just enough to reveal the faded Ranger insignia sewn inside. The patch was old, frayed at the edges, but visible. And undeniable. The hashtags came fast. Ranger down. Honor broken. Justice for the old man. But what came faster were the threads. Someone traced the girl's IP upload history. An anonymous account on X, it had just 4 posts, all within 20 minutes of the video going viral. The last post said, "This man led men through fire. Taylor couldn't lead a dog through a park." The account disappeared within the hour, but not before users noticed something chilling. The IP address that uploaded the original clip, it pinged from within a building on Pennsylvania Avenue, federal jurisdiction. FBI headquarters. Screenshots flooded Discord, Telegram, Reddit, and Instagram stories. A theory formed, then hardened. This wasn't just a bystander's upload. It was a leak, a controlled release, and people wanted to know why. But before anyone could find an answer, a right-wing news network went live with their angle. Hero officer under attack for doing his job. They cut the clip at 12 seconds, just before the scream about the Ranger tab, and added a voiceover. The officer was responding to a possible threat. In these turbulent times, our law enforcement must act fast. Comment sections split like tectonic plates. One side screamed, "He's a vet. He bled for this country." The other spat back, "You don't know the full story." Verified pundits called the video inflammatory. An ex-military contractor went viral himself, saying, "If that patch is real, then Taylor better start praying." The girl who uploaded it was doxxed within hours. Her school got called. Her parents got threats. But the video had already fractured into thousands of mirrors, screen-recorded, reposted, remixed with music, slowed down with subtitles, edited into TikTok duets where strangers whispered, "Don't look away." A former Ranger named Darnell Morse posted a clip in full uniform. His voice was low, shaking not from fear but fury. "We don't sew that tab for fashion. That man earned it, and you spat on it." That video alone got 8 million views in under 4 hours. But what made it explode was the follow-up. Someone found Taylor's personnel file. Leaked or hacked, no one knew, but suddenly, everyone knew Taylor had 3 prior complaints for excessive force, all buried under resolved internal. The comments turned lethal. The network that defended him doubled down, framing the outrage as leftist anti-police hysteria. But their hosts couldn't even finish sentences without being interrupted by on-screen supercuts. The blood, the boot, the badge, the broken man. The sound of a cane cracking became the internet's metronome. It played under protest chants, echoed in reels, and looped in live streams with titles like, "How many more heroes do they get to break?" Meanwhile, in private groups, veterans organized, former Green Berets, retired Navy SEALs, medics, infantry. They weren't tweeting, they were meeting. The names in the chat logs weren't influencers, they were initials, service numbers, call signs. One pinned message read, "This is not politics, this is betrayal." And still, Taylor hadn't said a word. The department released a half-hearted statement calling the incident under investigation and asking the public not to rush to judgment. That night, a group of teens projected the full 16-second video onto the side of City Hall. Cars honked. People clapped. Someone spray-painted below the screen, "He stood taller in handcuffs than you do in a badge." Even international pages picked it up. A Brazilian vet commented, "He wore the same insignia as my brother." A Ukrainian soldier posted, "We know what a warrior looks like. He is one." The hashtags are translated. The outrage didn't need subtitles. In just 12 hours, the clip became more than a video. It became a verdict, a question, a dare, a wound. And it hadn't even been a full day. The door slammed shut behind them, not with protocol but with pride, as if Taylor believed the echo alone could assert authority. He didn't look back, didn't speak, didn't offer a bench, just pointed to the floor like he was corralling a mutt. "Sit. No please. No need." The old man didn't protest. He glanced once at the empty steel bench bolted to the wall, then lowered himself slowly to the cold concrete, knees cracking but steady, as though the floor were familiar to him, as though dignity had nothing to do with elevation. Taylor remained standing, arms crossed, badge gleaming like a dare, the smirk curling beneath his voice. "Special Forces?" he scoffed, motioning toward the faded insignia half hidden beneath the man's jacket. "What was it, Rangers? Airborne? Or were you just the guy who polished boots and handed out water?" The man didn't answer. His posture was upright, hands still cuffed behind his back, the thin line of dried blood crusted at the edge of one wrist where the steel had torn skin. He stared ahead, not at Taylor, not at the wall, but somewhere beyond either, like a man accustomed to concrete and accusation. Taylor began to circle him. "You people always think those patches mean something. You wear 'em like they still buy respect." He crouched down slowly, bringing himself face to face. "Well, they don't. Not here. Not in this room. You're not overseas anymore. You're not in command. This isn't a battlefield, Grandpa. It's my house now. And in my house, relics sit on the floor." The old man's expression didn't shift. Taylor's jaw twitched. He hated silence more than screams. Screams he could shut down, but silence? Silence made you question who was actually in control. "You know," Taylor continued, "I used to think men like you were tough, until I saw what's left of you. Just hollow pride and war stories no one asked for." Still no reply. Taylor leaned in closer, voice lowering. "You think you're above all this? You think you don't belong in cuffs?" He waited. Nothing. "Go on then," he snarled. "Say something. Say one thing that justifies why you're sitting in my station like you're owed a goddamn statue." Finally, the old man turned his head and met Taylor's gaze. Not fast, not confrontational, just direct, deliberate. And in a voice that neither wavered nor sought permission, he asked, "Do you know where I've been?" Taylor blinked. For a moment, his composure cracked, not because of what was said, but because of how it was said. Calm, even, not challenging, just precise. He recovered with venom. "Yeah," he spat, "with the rest of the ghosts. Probably trading stories in some bar with other fossils, all of you bragging about how many people you killed before you lost your teeth." The old man didn't flinch. Not a muscle moved. It was as if Taylor's words had passed through the air, not skin. He stood abruptly, rattled by the absence of pain. Pain was easier to manipulate, but this stillness? It unsettled him in a way fists never could. Taylor looked up at the camera in the corner. Its red light blinked steadily. With one flick of a switch, he dimmed it, cutting the feed under the pretense of battery conservation, but really because he needed privacy, needed to reassert dominance. "That's better," he muttered. Behind him, the man hadn't moved. Outside the door, footsteps passed, paused, and faded. Through the narrow glass strip embedded in the wall, a familiar face appeared. Frank Delaney, retired, 32 years on the force. His eyes locked on the seated man for only a second, then turned away. No knock, no words, just recognition and retreat. Inside, Taylor paced again. "You think this buys you something?" He gestured at the man's silence. "You think silence makes you strong?" The man remained seated, breathing evenly, unmoved by insults, unmoved by time. Taylor reached into his pocket, pulled out a folding chair, and dragged it across the floor with unnecessary force before slumping into it, across from him. He leaned forward, elbows on knees. "I've broken louder men than you. I've seen junkies with more fight. You don't scare me." The man didn't respond, but he adjusted the edge of his coat slightly, and something slid from beneath the fabric to the ground. A silver ring. Simple. Worn. Taylor squinted. The old man picked it up and turned it once between his fingers before slipping it into his breast pocket. On the inside band were small etched letters. Unit 231, Fallujah. Taylor's expression darkened. "That's supposed to mean something? Some war buddies club? You think I care where you served?" He stood again, voice rising. "That was someone else's war. Someone else's country, someone else's time." He circled the man like a dog, testing for weakness, but the man didn't break, didn't shift. Taylor grew louder, angrier, but still, "Nothing. You don't get to look down on this station. You don't get to act like you're above our laws just because you dragged yourself through some sandbox 40 years ago." Still nothing. The silence became unbearable. Taylor leaned in again, close enough to see the reflection of his rage in the man's pupils. "Say something," he hissed. "Say something slick. One more military catchphrase. Give me the excuse." The old man looked up again, and this time he exhaled a single, centered breath. No words, just breathe, and then he closed his eyes. Not out of fatigue, out of conclusion, like the conversation in his mind was already over. Taylor stepped back, as if shoved by a force he didn't understand. He wiped his palms against his thighs, though they weren't sweating, checked his watch. 17 minutes since booking. He'd expected resistance, maybe defiance, even fear, but not this. This was worse. This was unreadable, uncontrollable. Across the hall, in the darkened observation booth, a junior officer was watching. No audio, just a muted video feed. And yet, something about the body language unsettled him. Taylor's aggression. The man's stillness. It didn't match protocol. He reached for the receiver, hesitated, then put it back down. Inside, the man shifted just enough to relieve pressure from his spine. The cuffs had begun to rub his skin raw, but he didn't complain. He didn't wince. He adjusted like someone who'd endured worse than steel and concrete. Taylor's voice dropped again, but not out of strategy, out of fatigue. "No one's coming for you, you know." He looked down, voice hard but hollow. "No one cares." The old man slowly opened his eyes. This time, he didn't look at Taylor. He looked at the ceiling. Steady, quiet, infinite. And in that look was the truth. He didn't need rescue. He didn't expect rescue. Because whatever was coming had already been set in motion. Because this wasn't fear. It was certain. And Taylor, in that moment, knew. He wasn't in control anymore. He didn't expect the first fracture to come from a signal tower on the edge of town. The footage, 16 seconds, shaky, imperfect, too real to deny, broke through the silence like a nail through a coffin lid. It didn't come from CNN. It didn't come from WNBX, the city's sleek metropolitan news outlet with glossy desks and editorial control filtered through City Hall. It came from a backwater independent channel tucked inside a strip mall behind a tire shop. Channel 5, Midwest Now. a place where local weather warnings shared airtime with bake sale announcements. But on that particular night, it found itself 20 seconds ahead of every national network in America. The segment didn't open with headlines or a prepared voiceover. It opened in full frame with the image of a man too old for the floor, hands cuffed behind his back and blood dripping from his wrist to the concrete below. The anchor was a woman in her early 30s, hair tied tightly back, face pale under the glow of studio lights that'd probably been installed before she was born. Her name tag read Samantha Pierce, but everyone in town called her Sammy, the daughter of a decorated Gulf War vet who used to ride the 4th of July parade route in full uniform until his knees gave out. Sammy wasn't supposed to be working that shift. The lead anchor had called out sick. What she hadn't said was that the mayor's office had quietly requested a delay on any developing reports regarding unrest involving veteran arrests. The word veteran had been underlined in red on the memo. But Channel 5 didn't have legal teams or political handlers. It had Sammy, and Sammy had eyes. She'd seen the clip 12 minutes earlier in the editing bay. She'd heard the audio, raw and cutting. "Sit, old man. You think this patch buys you something?" She had watched the handcuffs bite into the skin of a man who didn't scream, who didn't flinch, who didn't even look up. And when the control room asked, "Do we go with weather or local crime?" she said, "We lead with this." Then she pulled the papers from the teleprompter, tore them in half, and turned to the camera with her eyes already welling. Her voice cracked before the second sentence. Not from nervousness, not from lack of professionalism, but from memory. From 100 dinner-time talks with her father about how soldiers were never truly safe, not on the front line, not at home, not even in the towns they bled to defend. She had heard the silence in his breath every time the news covered a protest where police shoved a veteran aside because his uniform wasn't visible anymore. She had seen his fists tighten when he read about another forgotten name added to a wall that no one visited. So when Sammy Pierce faced the camera that night, she didn't blink. Her voice shook, but she didn't stop. She introduced the clip not as a journalist, but as a daughter. She didn't say alleged misconduct. She said, "What you're about to see may change the way you see this town. It changed the way I see it." And then the footage played. The impact was immediate. In a diner 3 blocks from the precinct, forks dropped mid-bite. On a construction site where crews were eating late dinner out of plastic containers, someone yelled, "Turn that up!" In a nursing home across the county line, 4 men who hadn't spoken since breakfast whispered the word Fallujah at the same time. And in the control room of Channel 5, the phone lines lit up like a battlefield. By the time the segment ended, over 70,000 views had already rippled through social media. The official city account posted a generic message. "The department is currently reviewing internal footage for procedural accuracy." But no one cared. The clip didn't need commentary. It didn't need context. It needed eyes, and it had them. Elsewhere, the larger networks were scrambling. WNBX had prepped a sanitized version of the incident, complete with a spokesperson from the mayor's office and a blurred-out still frame of the arrest. But when a junior producer tried to load the file into the 8:00 p.m. rundown, he received an internal warning. Segment flagged for delay. Do not air pending city council confirmation. He turned to his supervisor, confused. It's already viral. The man's only answer was, "Not in this building." The screen stayed black, and silence spread like a disease, but not outside, not anymore. At 8:27 p.m., a woman named Janine Alvarez stepped outside her brownstone with a cardboard sign. It read, in capital letters scrawled with a black marker, "Release the old man." She stood alone at first, across from the police station, holding the sign against the night air while her teenage son filmed from across the street. By 8:43, there were 7 others beside her. By 9:00, there were 34. Some were holding flags. Some were holding signs. Some just stood in quiet defiance. There was no megaphone, no chants, just presence. Just breathe. The police inside the precinct tried not to look, but they heard it. Not noise, but not silence. The sound of people choosing not to go home, choosing not to forget. Taylor hadn't left the station. He was in the hallway outside the holding cell, watching the feed flicker on a loop. The same 16 seconds played on every screen in the room. His lips curled, but not in amusement. He didn't speak. He just watched, over and over. His hand gripped the frame of the door so tightly that his knuckles went white. When an officer walked past him and muttered, "It's spreading," Taylor said nothing. He simply tilted his head, stared harder, and whispered under his breath, "They'll forget. Give it a day." But even as he spoke, he knew he was wrong, because something had cracked, and the crack was growing. Down the corridor, another officer flipped channels, expecting the story to vanish, but it was on Channel 12 now, and Channel 8, and a live stream run by a teenager who hadn't said a word all day, but now typed in all caps, "He never even flinched." Hashtags emerged like fireflies. The old man, still standing, hands that served. One of them trended nationally within 15 minutes. At 9:16 p.m., a call came in to Channel 5. It was from a woman with a tremor in her voice. "My husband, he served with someone named Ellis. I think that's him. Please, tell me it's not." Back at the station, Sammy Pierce stood in the hallway outside the studio, still wearing her blazer, hands shaking slightly as she scrolled through messages. Some were threats, some were thank yous. One simply said, "My dad saluted your broadcast." Her father, who hadn't spoken much since his second stroke, sat watching in a recliner at home. Tears slipped down the side of his cheek, but he didn't wipe them away. He just kept whispering one name. Not the name of the anchor, not the name of the station, but the name of the man in the clip, the man on the floor. "Ellis," he murmured. "Captain Ellis." And by the time the 10:00 p.m. national wrap-up tried to present the story with careful language and muted disclaimers, it was too late. The narrative wasn't in their hands anymore. It belonged to the public, to the eyes that had seen, to the mouths that had spoken, to the hands that held signs in the dark without a script. In a world where outrage often passed like weather, something about this story lingered, not because it was loud, but because he wasn't, because he hadn't begged, hadn't cursed, hadn't even tried to defend himself. The footage showed no struggle, no speech, just a man who'd sat down when ordered and then made everyone else stand up. By midnight, news trucks had arrived at the edge of town. Reporters tried to talk to the crowd, but no one wanted to be interviewed. They just held their signs, sipped coffee from foam cups, and waited, not for a hero, not for a riot, just for recognition, for someone, anyone, to come out of that station and admit what they had done. But no one came, not yet, because inside, the floor beneath Taylor was starting to shift, and he knew it. He could feel the weight of a man's silence shaking an entire room full of screens. He could see the tremor in his reflection as the loop played again, and again, and again, and still the old man hadn't said a word. While the crowd gathered outside the station in swelling silence, and the footage looped endlessly across a dozen networks, 400 miles away in a gray government building with no signage, a different kind of light flickered, subdued, coded, and unflinching. Room 4B, Sublevel 2, Quantico, a place few knew existed, and fewer still were allowed to enter. At exactly 9:48 p.m., a terminal blinked twice and a system auto-tempered a clearance protocol marked with 3 letters, ACC, short for Active Consultant Escalation. It didn't come from a phone call nor a local precinct. It came from a signal embedded in an internal registry, activated by time and silence. There was no siren, no voice, just a line of text blinking in yellow. A4 flagged cross-verized sand vow. In that moment, a single analyst, mid-30s, sharp suit, no name tag, pressed his fingers to a biometric scanner, entered a passcode known only to 7 living agents, and opened a profile labeled Confidential Classified Level 5. The screen loaded slowly, as if reluctant. The file name, Ellis Thomas V. A digital photo appeared, older, grainy, clearly scanned from hard copy, showing a young man in uniform, eyes straight ahead, jaw clenched, standing shoulder to shoulder with a 3-star general, whose name had once echoed through Pentagon corridors like gospel. The caption beneath the image read, Fallujah Command Strategy, Joint Ops Briefing, March 2004. Next to it is a black and white document marked with red diagonal stripes titled Special Operations Command, Consultant Status, IMT2, Clearance Code T2031B/Sanvow. The analyst didn't speak. He had seen files that described political assassinations, rogue intelligence missions, unacknowledged operations on 3 continents. But this file carried something different, not just secrecy, gravity, the kind of weight that could crack the floor if mishandled. He read silently, lips unmoving, while the lines flowed like blood on digital paper. Subject: Ellis Thomas Vincent, D.O.B. 1949, place of birth, Lorain, Ohio. Service record: United States Army, enlisted, 1967, airborne qualified. Multiple deployments across Southeast Asia, selected to Special Forces Group 5, 1972, deployed to Central America, Northern Africa, and the Middle East, honored for operations that remain redacted under Executive Directive 44FF, reportedly involved in over 25 strategic missions, 6 currently sealed at the presidential level. Post-retirement status: recalled as a civilian consultant under Operational Emergency Provision 17B in 1999 following destabilization in the Persian Gulf. Engaged in Post-Conflict Rehabilitation Command, Structuring and Counterinsurgency Assessment. Current clearance: active consultant / red stab / access class, Sanvow. The analyst blinked twice and leaned closer. Below the clearance line, in red block letters, was the directive that made his breath catch. Subject is not to be detained under any civilian or municipal circumstance without direct order from Federal Oversight Council. Violation of this condition triggers immediate interrogation. He sat back. The cursor blinked once, then twice. Then a prompt appeared: escalate breach protocol Y/N. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into the drawer beside him and pulled out a laminated protocol card. ACE Tier 1 Response Guidelines. The last time one had been triggered was 5 years ago, and that had involved an ambassador's kidnapping in Caracas. He read the checklist twice, then keyed in the response. Across the room, a second screen lit up. A secondary analyst, younger, glanced over and narrowed his eyes. "Ace, that's not one of ours," the senior analyst replied without turning. "It is now." 2 floors up, the data packet began to propagate. 7 agency terminals received mirrored files. At 9:57 p.m., a Federal Coordination Center in D.C. received a top priority escalation code tied to Ellis's profile. Inside a sealed chamber of the Bureau's Historical Clearance Division, a retired colonel was pulled from bed to review the name that had just reappeared on active federal systems. He didn't ask why. He just said one word: finally. Back in Quantico, the original analyst watched the screen populate with nested folders, each requiring separate keys, each opening slowly, reluctantly, like doors long rusted shut. Operation Sanvow. Date initiated March 15, 2003. Clearance level: presidential eyes only. Participants: redacted. Redacted. Outcome: strategic mitigation achieved. Subject instrumental in the operation, stabilization, and mission integrity. Recommended for continued engagement at federal discretion. Beneath that summary, a video file. 6 seconds long, no audio. It showed a younger Ellis, mid-50s, hard eyes, desert fatigues, standing before a table of weapons and maps, briefing 2 unidentified men in suits. He pointed at a satellite image with the confidence of a man who didn't need permission to lead. He wasn't requesting approval, he was issuing directions. And the men, powerful men, listened. The screen flashed again. Incident: Bitter Creek, PD. Unauthorized detention. Subject: Ellis Thomas V. Status. Flagged. The analyst exhaled slowly. They have no idea what they've touched. He opened the local incident report, extracted the arresting officer's name, Taylor, SAF-AA. A notation beside the name showed no federal clearance, no interagency cooperation training, and no record of intelligence compliance. Rookie. Aggressive. Disciplinary review pending. And now, viral. The analyst leaned back, stared at the wall of data, and muttered to himself, "They think they cuffed a civilian." He pulled up a map of Bitter Creek, zoomed in. The precinct was highlighted in yellow. The public gathering outside was already marked by heat mapping from local cell towers. It was growing. He clicked another button. A second file opened. A psychological operations profile compiled on Ellis in 2011 during a Department of Defense readiness review. The conclusion was chilling in its clarity. Subject possesses advanced threat readiness capability, tactical foresight, and emotional regulation beyond standard combat veterans. Displays high resilience under duress, exhibits behavioral control consistent with long-term strategic intent. Recommend limited direct provocation. The subject may not initiate a response, but the system will. The analyst looked at that last sentence again. The subject may not initiate a response, but the system will. And it already had. At 10:06 p.m., a federal response coordinator logged into a private terminal, viewed the brief, and issued a single directive to local enforcement liaisons. Hold all contact. Do not engage. Await federal assessment. The message was routed through encrypted lines, hitting law enforcement hubs in under a minute. The precinct in Bitter Creek received it last. The command appeared on their monitor in plain white text, "Do not process detainee." I await directive, but no one in the station saw it. The alert light blinked beneath Taylor's untouched inbox. Inside his office, Taylor stood staring at the muted television feed. He watched himself on screen handcuffing Ellis. He watched the old man's breath, watched the silence, watched it again and again. Behind him, a junior officer knocked once. "Sir, there's a new directive." Taylor didn't turn. He didn't answer. The door closed. Back in Quantico, the analyst closed the file. He had seen enough. The system had moved. The flag had been raised. The name was no longer forgotten, and Thomas Vincent Ellis, once a shadow beneath a patch and a memory, now sat in a municipal holding cell while the full weight of a government that had never really let him go stirred awake. Because Ellis hadn't vanished. He'd been waiting, and the moment they laid hands on him, they hadn't arrested a man. They'd activated a protocol. The email from Quantico hadn't reached him yet. The blinking alert on the precinct terminal still sat unopened, its subject line sterile and unassuming. But for Jed Carmichael, the message had arrived long before the servers could catch up. It had arrived in the hallway, in the silence between Taylor's taunts and Ellis's breath. It had arrived the moment he heard that voice again. Not Ellis's voice, but Taylor's. Sharp, arrogant, spitting contempt like he'd earned it. And something inside Jed had cracked in a way he couldn't name. He had been standing just outside the holding cell door when Taylor shouted, "Sit, old man!" And something about those 3 words dragged him 17 years back to a different corridor, halfway around the world, where orders had sounded eerily similar but came from someone wearing the same patch now faded on Ellis's jacket. Jed hadn't seen that insignia in over a decade, but the moment he caught sight of it earlier that night, tucked beneath the blood and dust, it felt less like a symbol and more like a summons. He stood now in the precinct briefing room, lights off, blinds drawn. The hallway behind him humming with nervous energy as murmurs of protests and camera crews filtered through the building. But inside this room it was quiet, too quiet. And Jed hated it because silence didn't ask for permission. It forced memory upon you. He leaned against the edge of the table, palms pressed to the cold metal, breathing through his nose like a man trying not to drown. On the monitor in front of him, the paused frame from the security footage showed Ellis exactly as he had been hours ago, on the floor, hands cuffed, back straight, head slightly bowed, unbroken. Jed stared at that face, the lines deeper now, the hair grayer, but the eyes, God, the eyes hadn't changed. Not back then, not tonight. Afghanistan, 2006. Kandahar province. Jed hadn't known who the man was at first. He had only known the call sign Viper 6 and the cold, precise orders that had pulled him and 12 other soldiers out of a crossfire that should have shredded them like paper. They'd been lost, surrounded, 2 comms units down, and the lieutenant in charge had frozen mid-order, paralyzed not by fear, but incompetence. Jed had radioed for help anyway, voice shaking, breath short, expecting nothing, and then the sand had roared with rotor blades, and a voice came over the comms, not yelling, just firm, surgical. "Mark your dead. Move west. I'll clear the rest." That voice had cleared a path through enemy fire without blinking, had taken the perimeter with 3 men and a calm that bordered on inhuman, and when Jed stumbled into the extraction zone bleeding and covered in the dirt of his failure, the man hadn't said, "You're welcome." He'd said, "Next time, make sure the guy next to you deserves to be there." Jed never forgot those words, didn't ask for a name, didn't speak again that day. He'd gone back to base, filed a sanitized version of the event, swallowed the shame and tried to erase the sound of that voice. But it came back years later, during evaluation for Special Assignments Command. Ellis was on the panel. Jed had walked in, chest puffed, citations in hand, recommendations glowing. He hadn't recognized the man at first. The file said consultant. Jed didn't care. He was focused on approval, on advancing, on proving something. But Ellis had sat quietly during the interview, hands folded, eyes like scalpels, letting the other officers speak until the final 3 questions. That's when Jed knew. He knew from the pause before Ellis asked anything, from the way he said his name, not like someone reading it, but like someone remembering it. And then, calm as a prayer, Ellis had asked, "If a man freezes in combat, who do you protect first, him or the man beside him?" Jed had stuttered, offered a textbook answer. Duty. Chain of command, rules of engagement. Ellis had looked at him for a long time, then closed the file and without raising his voice had said, "You can train for combat, you can't train for character. You failed when it cost lives. Don't do it again under my patch." The recommendation was denied, the door was closed. Jed had told himself it was politics, that it was old men clinging to past wars, that Ellis was overreaching. But now, watching him on that screen, Jed knew the truth. It wasn't personal. It was precise. Ellis had known who he was, and still didn't yell, still didn't berate. He'd just seen through him. And tonight, Taylor's voice had rung in Jed's ears with a frequency that Ellis's voice never had. Too loud, too eager, too insecure. And Jed had stood there, frozen. Not because he didn't know what was happening, but because he did. Because he recognized that same dynamic. The loud one always believed he was winning. The quiet one always had the plan. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee. It was cold. He didn't drink it. He just held it, grounding himself, watching the monitor like a confession booth. Ellis hadn't even looked at him yet, hadn't acknowledged Jed's presence. But Jed felt it anyway, felt the weight of that silence pressing against his chest, like gravity, like a judgment not yet delivered. And he knew the judgment wasn't coming from some courtroom or public hearing. It was coming from the look Ellis had given Taylor. Not hostile, not pitiful, just knowing. And Jed recognized that look because he'd seen it once in a mirror, after a failed mission and a folded recommendation letter that still sat at the back of his sock drawer. Outside, the chants were growing, nothing loud, just consistent. "Release the old man," over and over. Like a heartbeat, the building couldn't be ignored. Jed rubbed his thumb over his badge. The brass felt colder than usual. He thought of the words Ellis had once said to a room full of men too young to know better. "Dying for your country is honorable. Dying beside a fool is not." At the time, Jed had rolled his eyes. Now, he wasn't sure which one he'd become. He walked out of the briefing room slowly, as if the hallway might collapse beneath him. As he passed the holding cells, he paused at the door. The glass was fogged. Ellis sat exactly where he had been, still upright, still unreadable. Jed didn't enter. He just stood there, watching, silent. And for the first time in his career, he realized silence wasn't the absence of control. It was the result of someone who no longer needed it. Jed had never been a man who feared silence. In fact, during his time in uniform, he had often found silence to be a kind of comfort, a space where lies couldn't hide, where authority either stood on its own or collapsed without theatrics. But tonight's silence wasn't that kind. It wasn't neutral. It wasn't empty. It felt designed, concentrated, the kind that wrapped around your throat without pressure, the kind that whispered, "You've already waited too long." He could feel the weight of it as he walked down the corridor, past the break room, past the booking counter, each step more measured than the last. He wasn't rushing, he wasn't delaying, he was aligning, like a man stepping onto a wire he knew was live, but didn't know how live. The comms room door hadn't been used in weeks. Dusk lined the threshold, and the panel lights blinked with that outdated, analog slowness that made new officers laugh. Jed didn't laugh. He shut the door behind him, picked up the landline and dialed 4 digits that weren't written down anywhere. Not in any SOP, not in any patrol log, not in any system Taylor had access to. The line clicked once. Then it breathed. A voice came through. Female, no accent, no warmth. Name, it said, Lieutenant Jed Carmichael, Bitter Creek PD, ID 4390. Protocol, ANO04, he said slowly. Active consultant, unlawful detainment, civilian station, time in custody 32 minutes, detainee not processed, no statement, no resistance, no authorization. There was a pause, brief, surgical, then the voice replied with 4 words, clean and sharp. Vehicles are en route, no questions, no instructions, just motion. Then the line went dead, not disconnected, and ended. Jed held the receiver in his hand for a second longer than necessary, not because he didn't know what he had triggered, but because he did. When he finally replaced it in the cradle, it felt like he was laying down something ceremonial, something final. The room had no windows. The air felt colder now, not in temperature, in intent. He walked out without turning off the light, crossed the hallway into his office and shut the door with an almost reverent quiet. He didn't sit. He went straight to the drawer, pulled out the black notebook, the one no one asked about because no one dared, and opened it to the last blank page. He didn't hesitate. He wrote, "If this reaches you, I failed. He warned me once, and I didn't listen. You're standing on a fuse. Walk carefully." He didn't sign it. He folded the paper once, slid it into the back pocket of his jacket, and locked the drawer. Then he moved to his desk terminal, inserted the small flash drive marked with a red X, and waited. The file opened without a prompt. He clicked on the audio labeled Holding B-1903. The waveform loaded. Taylor's voice sharp and venomous. Ellis's silence sharper still. The scrape of boots. The metallic click of cuffs. A minute and 49 seconds of everything wrong. Jed didn't play it again. He dragged the file to the trash, hit delete. Confirmed. Then he went deeper into the root of the operating system, wiped the residual log entries. Then he reached into his drawer, pulled out the metal lighter with his father's initials, lit the only disk backup, and dropped it into a metal tray lined with receipts he no longer needed. The disk curled under the flame, the red ink on its label bubbling, blistering, dissolving into dark plastic smoke. He opened the window to vent it. Not that it mattered. The smoke didn't need to leave. The truth was already known. Jed looked up at the wall. The old station clock mounted above the filing shelves had been ticking since before he joined the force. It was analog, silver-rimmed, institutional, forgettable. But tonight it looked different. The second hand jerked forward. 7:27 p.m. He stood up, closed the window, adjusted his collar, and left the office. The hallway had changed. It wasn't louder. It wasn't quieter, but something in its shape felt wrong, like time had pulled tighter around its corners. He passed the holding cells without looking inside. He didn't need to. He could feel Ellis still there, not watching, just existing. And that was enough to alter everything. He walked to the back corridor into the evidence room, not to retrieve anything, just to move, just to breathe. The room smelled like dust and chain of custody tags. He stood among the rows of lockers, rows of misfiled things from misjudged lives, and he waited, but not for time, for wait, for that moment just before a shift occurs when a building doesn't creak but feels like it should. 7:28 p.m. He returned to the front lobby. The receptionist had turned down the volume on the muted TV. The same 16-second clip played on a loop. She pretended not to notice Jed standing behind her, and Jed didn't force her to. Outside the front doors, beyond the blinds, the crowd was growing. Their signs weren't moving. Their mouths weren't open, but their presence was the loudest thing in the station. He stepped into the hallway again, slower this time. The buzz of fluorescent lighting above his head now pulsed like a failing artery. He walked past the locker room, past Taylor's closed office door. No sound, no breath, just heat. Not physical, but ethical. The kind that builds when law collides with something it doesn't understand. He stopped at the central corridor, just beneath the clock. 7:29 p.m. He could hear the dispatch radio now. A faint voice crackled through. "Central, this is Unit 7. The estimated crowd at 75. Holding perimeter, no aggression." The line faded, then returned. "They're not chanting. They're just standing." Silence again. Jed pressed his lips together. He looked up. 7:30 p.m. And the second hand didn't move. At first he thought it was a blink, a trick of the light, a mechanical lag, but then he stood still, fully still, and waited. 5 seconds. 10. Nothing. The hand remained frozen. No tick, no pulse, just stillness. The kind that had no interest in being temporary. The kind that meant something. Jed looked around. No footsteps, no static. Even the buzz above seemed to have thinned out, like the air had backed away. He checked his phone. Signal. None. He raised his radio. Before he could speak, it clicked once. Then a voice came through. Low, flat, measured. "We're outside." Jed didn't answer. He didn't need to. He looked back up at the clock, its silver rim suddenly too perfect, too round, like an eye that had closed on purpose. The second hand hadn't moved. The moment hadn't passed. Because maybe it wasn't a moment. Maybe it was the end of the movement itself. The second hand on the station clock still hadn't moved. Taylor had walked back from the holding corridor twice without realizing he had made the trip. Jed was nowhere in sight now, but Taylor could feel him. Or rather, he could feel the space Jed had left behind, like a void that remembered who had passed through it. The front desk officer avoided his eyes. The radios had stopped crackling. No new calls. No dispatch tones, just silence and pressure. Not the kind that demanded a fight, the kind that made men question whether they were still standing in a place they recognized. He paced past the water cooler, grabbed a cup, poured halfway, then stopped. The buzz of the light above flickered against the rim of the plastic as he held the cup still. He hadn't realized his hand was shaking until the ripples formed inside it. He turned back down the hallway toward the cells, one foot in front of the other. Not fast, not slow, just deliberate enough to feel like defiance against something he couldn't name. At the entrance to Cell B, he stopped. He hadn't opened the door yet. Just stared through the glass slit and watched. Ellis hadn't moved, not since the last time he looked. Still upright, still silent, still impossible to define. Taylor blinked. His throat tightened. He hated how his mind started offering explanations for the immobility. Hated how it whispered that maybe it wasn't strength, maybe it was control. And maybe control, when it looked like this, didn't need volume to drown someone. He opened the door. The sound of it sliding inward felt too loud. The hum of the hallway behind him felt too distant. Ellis didn't look up. Taylor stepped inside, boots echoing against concrete. Then he spoke, not in command, not in sarcasm, but in something colder. "What the hell are you looking at?" His voice bounced once off the wall, then came back through the station's internal speaker system. Someone had left the internal radio channel open again. His words echoed faintly, hollow and misplaced. "What the hell are you looking at?" The station froze. The tech in the control booth reached for the volume, but too late. The line had carried it everywhere. Front desk, break room, locker area, even the parking lot speaker gave off a faint murmur. Taylor didn't care. His face twitched, and he stepped closer. That's when Ellis looked up, not with sharpness, not with malice, just acknowledgement. The way a surgeon might glance at a scalpel before deciding whether to pick it up. Taylor expected a stare down, expected defiance, but instead Ellis looked past him, down at his hand. The blood on his knuckle from the earlier scuffle had dried now, darkened to a matte rust tone along the edge of his wrist. He flexed the fingers slightly, then curled the hand closed. Not in pain, not in threat, just enough to feel it tighten. Then he relaxed again. That simple motion, the compression and release, hit Taylor harder than any insult. It made him acutely aware of how loud his heartbeat was, how thin the fabric of his shirt felt against his chest. Ellis shifted his posture, slow and precise, just enough for something to slip from the inside pocket of his shirt. A small, folded piece of paper dropped to the floor between them. It didn't float, it didn't spin. It landed edge first, folded tight, like it had been waiting. Taylor's eyes locked onto it. For half a second, he thought about not touching it, thought about leaving it there as if ignoring it would reduce its power. But then he bent down, picked it up, unfolded it. It read, "If I don't leave this room, open file 4 black." Block letters, no flourish, no signature, no ambiguity. Taylor froze. His fingers stayed locked around the edges of the paper. For some reason, he looked at the corner of the cell, as if expecting someone else to be standing there. He glanced back at Ellis, who still hadn't moved, but whose eyes had returned to center, no longer watching, no longer measuring, just waiting. Taylor took a step back. His fingers twitched. He folded the note again and slid it into his pocket. He tried to convince himself that it was a bluff. Those file numbers didn't mean anything, that there was no such thing as 4 black, that even if there was no way Ellis had the authority to invoke it. But the voice in his head, the one trained to doubt, to deflect, to dominate, had gone quiet. He turned abruptly and exited the room. He walked straight to the break room, his mind cycling through questions with no punctuation. Who is he? What is this? Why now? Where are they? What have I done? He reached the counter, grabbed another paper cup and filled it too quickly. Water spilled down the side. He reached for the napkins but stopped. His hand hovered. He looked up. The mirror above the sink caught him fully. His face flushed pale, his jaw slightly uneven, his collar crooked, his eyes moving, twitching, not with fatigue, with realization. He wasn't afraid of Ellis. He was afraid of what Ellis had made him see in himself. He stepped back. The cup slipped, hit the counter, bounced, then crashed to the floor. Water splashed his boots. The sound rang too loudly in the quiet. A technician passing in the hallway paused. Jed, still watching from dispatch, didn't move. He didn't have to. He'd heard the echo through the wall, heard the hesitation in Taylor's step, heard the silence behind every bravado word. Taylor stared at the water on the floor, the shape it took around his feet. He didn't bend to clean it, didn't look for the mop. He just stood there, staring at the reflection of himself in the puddle, distorted, broken by ripples. No longer whole. He turned his head slightly toward the hall again, half expecting Ellis to be standing there, even though he hadn't moved. Of course he hadn't moved. That was the point. He didn't need to. Back in cell B, Ellis adjusted his wrist inside the cuff, not to loosen it, just to feel it. The metal had dug slightly into his skin, but he didn't flinch. He sat still, legs grounded, back straight, the position of a man who knew how much his silence cost the room. Outside the cell, 2 junior officers passed, slowed, glanced, then kept walking. They didn't speak. No one had since the intercom broadcast. A silence had settled over the building, not the absence of noise, but the presence of consequence. The kind that doesn't need to declare itself because everyone already knows it's there. Taylor returned to his office, but didn't sit. He stood by the window, blinds half closed, eyes on the distant movement outside. The protesters were still there, still quiet, still unmoving. He checked his watch. The second hand on his wristwatch was moving, but the one on the hallway wall was still stuck at 7:30. He picked up the phone, stared at it, and considered calling someone. Anyone. Internal, external, legal, PR. But his fingers didn't dial, because he didn't know what he'd say. A man is sitting in my holding cell, and I think the building is starting to orbit around him. No, that wouldn't work. That wasn't evidence. That was fear. And men like Taylor didn't admit to fear, not out loud, not even to themselves. He hung up the phone. The door behind him opened. Jed stood there, no badge in hand, no words on the mouth. He didn't step in, he just looked. Taylor met his eyes. Jed nodded once, barely. Taylor didn't answer. Back in the hallway, the station breathed again. The ventilation kicked back on. The hallway light blinked twice, then steadied. But no one relaxed. Because somewhere inside, a man was sitting with blood on his knuckles, a note in circulation, and nothing more to say. He wasn't armed, he wasn't standing, he wasn't speaking, but everyone heard him, and that, somehow, was the loudest thing that had ever happened inside those walls. Taylor was still there, behind the dim glass of the observation room, his eyes no longer fixed on anything in particular. Though Ellis hadn't moved, not a shift, not a twitch beyond a fleeting glance, his presence felt like a broken rib stabbed into the very heart of the force. Every breath in the station seemed filtered through an invisible layer of pressure, as if any sudden movement might awaken something no one dared to name. Jed stood in the hallway, not leaning on the wall, not speaking, his head tilted slightly toward the faint hum from the air vents. Not to listen, but to breathe deeper. Someone out by the front desk dropped a pen. The sound rang out like a gunshot. And then other sounds didn't follow any sirens, no screeching tires, no banging doors, only a shift in the air's weight. 3 black SUVs appeared at once. No flashing lights, no wailing sirens, no lead vehicle. They didn't swerve in dramatically. They entered with steady, unbothered precision, as though every motion had already been programmed. The first stopped at the curb, the second blocked the exit, the third parked at a perfect 45-degree angle in front of the main steps. No symmetry, no elegance, only deliberate control. All doors opened simultaneously, not rushed, not delayed, and not a single slogan was shouted. No orders, no introductions. The woman who stepped out first wasn't wearing sunglasses. No briefcase, no stylized government suit. Her outfit fit perfectly, with not a crease out of place. She walked through the glass entry like she owned the foundation beneath it. She didn't pause at the security checkpoint. She didn't glance around. She hadn't come to ask. She had come to an end. When she stopped at the junction between the front desk and the hallway to the holding cells, she raised a badge, not to explain, but to kill all questions before they could be born. "Who's Taylor?" she asked. Not loud, not slow, not aggressive, but with the weight of a period at the end of an irreversible sentence. Jed turned. Taylor stepped out from his office with a gait less certain than usual, lips parting, but the sound catching in his throat. He took one step, then halted. The sentence never finished. The woman didn't respond. She nodded. That was all. Her eyes shifted left. The man who had exited behind her, tall, unreadable, turned left without needing a cue. The third agent, lean, unplaceable in gender or tone, turned right. No one touched anyone. No signals exchanged. But the formation was complete in exactly 3 seconds. Each footstep established a space no one else could enter. No one inside the station said a word. No one still thought they were in control. A young officer near the records room started to speak. He stepped half a pace forward, arm reaching toward the holding corridor. The tall agent simply looked at him, turned his shoulder a fraction, and within 3 seconds the officer was against the wall, unharmed, unbruised, but completely neutralized. No shouting, no weapons drawn, no fuss. The message landed without blood. This was reclamation. The door to the holding sector opened via an encrypted badge. No one asked for keys, no one requested names. The system recognized them. Somewhere inside Ellis's belt, a microchip, smaller than a grain of rice, embedded in the seam, had begun to transmit a silent alert 25 minutes after he stopped transmitting active movement. The system marked it as unauthorized stillness, a code that triggered interagency mobilization without human approval, a protocol that hadn't been used since 2011. The door to Cell B clicked, quietly, softly. No one touched it. Ellis remained seated. He did not rise. He did not speak. But as the female agent stepped inside, he raised his eyes, just enough to acknowledge. No salute, no words, just recognition. She didn't move further. She stood 3 feet from the man who once rerouted a theater-wide operation in Afghanistan with a handwritten note on the back of a ration box. She didn't lower her head, didn't explain. Her presence was the explanation. Ellis stood up. Slow, precise. He adjusted his sleeve. The cuff is still tight, but no longer biting. He straightened his back with the ease of someone who had survived much worse than this. His expression didn't change, but every man watching felt smaller. Down the hall, Taylor stood frozen, watching the scene unfold through the hallway glass. His mouth parted slightly. Ellis didn't look at him. Didn't pause, but Taylor stepped back anyway, the note in his pocket. It felt heavier now. If I don't leave this room, open file 4 black, it was no longer a threat. It was a verdict, already stamped. No one followed. No one asked for forms. No one signed anything. No calls were made, no reports filed. When they passed the front desk, the wind outside caught the edge of a loose paper. It fluttered, but didn't lift. The air, like the rest of the building, had nothing left to offer in resistance. The SUVs remained where they had arrived, still, running, ready. The doors closed with an almost silent press of pressure seals. No slamming, no punctuation. Inside the station, no one moved for another full minute. And then, just as the last black vehicle pulled out from the curb, the hallway clock ticked once, 7:31. This time, no one thought it was slow. They knew it had simply waited for someone worth marking. The moment hung in the air like the tail end of a siren, sharp and unfinished. Taylor's smirk hadn't even faded when the double doors behind him opened. Not with the slam he expected, but a silence that cracked louder than a gunshot. Agent O'Hara stepped in first, face carved from stone, followed by 2 federal officers, both dressed in plain tactical gray, the kind that didn't scream for attention because they didn't need to. Taylor blinked, still halfway through a sentence about protocol violations and retaliatory nonsense. His eyes landed on the folder in O'Hara's hand, then on the metallic glint in the other's. A pair of cuffs, real, polished, federal. "Matthew Taylor," O'Hara said, her voice flat but final. "You are under arrest by direct order of the Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The silence didn't just return. It deepened. For a man who had weaponized his voice for so long, the sound of no one defending him was the first blow. Taylor chuckled, that same razor-thin edge to his tone. "On what grounds? This station's mine. You don't get to walk in here and play cowboy." "On grounds authorized under Title 18, Section 242. She replied, unfolding the document with mechanical precision. "Deprivation of rights under color of law. And obstruction of federal evidence." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The bold seal at the top of the warrant did the shouting. Below it, crisp and unmistakable, the signature of the director. Taylor's face twitched, not with fear, but calculation. He tilted his head, eyes darting toward Jed, who stood like a fixture of the room. Jed didn't return the glance. Instead, he reached up slowly, fingers unfastening the brass badge on his chest. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The sound of the badge landing on the table was a verdict. That was when Taylor moved. Not toward violence, but toward performance. He raised his hands in mock surrender, lips twisting into a parody of grace. "Guess I won't be needing coffee. Turn around," one agent ordered, and he did, too quickly, too smoothly, like someone who'd rehearsed this moment in the mirror but never thought it would come. The cuffs clicked closed. The echo was louder than it should have been. Outside the observation window, screens blinked in succession, footage cued, time-stamped, but one in particular lit the air with its grainy, brutal clarity. A 16-second clip, centered and damning. A baton, a scream, a child's voice calling from the corner. A woman's hand is trying to shield. Taylor's voice, undeniable, commanding, cold. "Preserve that," O'Hara said, nodding toward the screen. "It was logged and backed up to the FBI Evidence Corps 2 hours ago. The chain of custody is sealed. Any attempt to discredit or erase it is now a felony." Taylor didn't respond. For once, he had no script. But his silence was not the kind that surrendered. It was the kind that sharpened. Jed looked at him for the first time. It wasn't pity. It wasn't rage. Just the hollowness of someone who'd once believed in a uniform more than in a man. "You had every chance Jed murmured, not for Taylor's benefit, but for himself. "You made your choices." Taylor sneered. "So did you." But his words had no weight anymore. Not here. Not with wrists locked and eyes avoiding. The room cleared fast. O'Hara signed off the intake, initialed the warrant copy, and ordered Taylor held pending transfer. No press, no delays, no leverage. When the door finally shut behind him, the sound wasn't a slam, it was a seal. A second later, internal comms buzzed. A voice crackled from upstairs. "Command confirms the arrest. Judge Morales issued the bond refusal. Taylor's staying put," and just like that, the balance snapped. The shift wasn't loud. It didn't come with cheers or celebration. It came with the measured, clinical collapse of a man who thought power was permanent, only to learn that documentation bites harder than bullets when handled right. Jed didn't pick the badge back up. He just stood there, watching the monitors cycle through timestamp after timestamp until the 16-second clip repeated again, this time slower, sharper. Every frame was more violent by the second, and he whispered, so low only he could hear it, "God damn, we let it go too far." But remorse had no jurisdiction here, only consequence. The screen flickered once, then locked. Evidence secure. Logged. Immutable. Outside, the building exhaled. Inside, no one said it out loud, but they all felt it. The first wall had cracked. And somewhere in a boardroom 500 miles away, the director of the FBI placed her pen back in its holder, leaned forward, and muttered the words now making their way through the veins of the bureau. One down. Then she picked up the next folder. News didn't travel through whispers anymore. It burst through encrypted channels, into terminals across field offices, marked priority flash. The name Matthew Taylor is flagged in red, with the annotation, arrested. Multiple agents paused mid-tack, scrolling back to confirm what they just saw. The file, time-stamped 2 hours before the arrest, left no doubt. This wasn't reactive, it was surgical. O'Hara stood over the intake desk, gloves off, coat draped on her arm. The air still tasted of authority. Her phone buzzed. She read the message once, twice, then slid it back in her coat pocket without a word. It was done. But what she didn't say, what no one dared to say yet, was that Taylor's arrest was not the end of anything. It was the signal, a green light, an authorization, the first domino with a federal seal. The man who once strutted into interrogation rooms barking orders now sat behind a 2-inch thick plexiglass wall, under constant watch, denied visitors, phone calls, or even counsel until the next procedural hearing. The badge he used like a shield was gone. The station that bowed under his orders no longer belonged to him. He could glare, he could snarl, but the metal walls didn't blink. Inside holding cell A7, Taylor pressed his palm flat against the cold bench, tracing the rivets with his fingers, calculating angles, exits, weaknesses. Not of the cell, of the people. He was used to navigating systems, but this wasn't a system anymore. It was a verdict unfolding 1 minute at a time. Jed lingered by the edge of the hallway, staring down the long corridor as officers shuffled paperwork and avoided his gaze. He didn't belong here anymore, not because someone told him so, because the weight on his chest told him louder than any reprimand. He walked to the badge on the table, didn't touch it, just looked. Somewhere behind him, a rookie muttered, "Did you ever think you'd see Taylor in cuffs?" Jed didn't turn. "I didn't think I'd live long enough to wish I had." The hallway swallowed his words. In the evidence room, 2 agents logged the 16-second clip under dual authentication. A hard copy was burned to disk, placed in a biometric safe, and labeled Primary Profile, DOJ Case, Ref 3428A. There would be no loopholes. No room for procedural sabotage. This wasn't a scandal to be spun. It was a fact. Fossilized. As night crept in, a heavy rain tapped against the rooftop. Inside, no one moved fast anymore. Everything slowed, deliberate, measured, the kind of pace that followed justice after too long in the dark. Taylor watched the rain, too, but not like a prisoner, like a man replaying every face he thought would never betray him. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes, because deep down even Taylor knew whatever came next would be quieter, colder, and it wouldn't carry a badge. It would carry memory, and memory never forgets who struck first. The moment Taylor disappeared down the hallway, swallowed by steel and protocol, a hush settled, not the tense kind before violence, but the reverent quiet that follows a reckoning. For a second, no one moved, not the agents, not the officers, not even the flickering monitor on the wall that had looped the 16-second clip a dozen times. It paused, frozen mid-frame. In the sudden stillness, something shifted. A small metallic clink echoed across the floor. Barely audible, but unmistakable. The Special Forces insignia. It had slipped from a breast pocket in the chaos, unnoticed by all except one, the old man. He had been standing near the wall, out of sight, out of focus, like a relic meant to fade. But as the door closed behind Taylor, he stepped forward, not fast, not dramatic, just deliberate. The floorboards didn't creak under him. His boots didn't drag. He moved with the exactness of someone who had once marched across continents and never once looked over his shoulder. He knelt, not because he had to, but because the badge deserved that. His fingers, veined and scarred from decades that had written their stories in silence, reached for the insignia. He didn't lift it with ceremony. He didn't dust it off. He simply held it, as if measuring its weight against all the years it had once carried. Behind him, an FBI officer, younger, still pressed by rules, but with enough memory of his father's war stories to recognize the shape of reverence, straightened. He didn't speak. He stood at attention, heels together, arms locked at his sides. No one told him to. No one had to. The old man rose. Slowly, with gravity, with finality. His shoulder lifted as he affixed the insignia back to his chest, not in pride, but in restoration, not as a man seeking recognition, but as a symbol returning to where it belonged. The badge didn't gleam. It didn't need to. The light in the room bent around him anyway. The air held. No one cleared their throat. No one resumed typing. Somewhere across the room, a coffee cup stopped, halfway to someone's mouth, and never made it the rest of the way. Across the hallway, a cadet, barely 20, still smelling of fresh starch and classroom certainties, watched. Lips parted. He had missed the arrest, caught only the tail end of the clip, and whispered. But now he saw something else. Not a headline, not a defendant, not a victim. A posture, a bearing, a history in flesh. His hand rose slowly, uncertain at first, then steadier. It wasn't textbook. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. A salute not to rank, but to resilience. His face flushed with something he couldn't yet name. Part awe, part instinct. He did not ask for permission. Reverence does not wait for protocol. Others noticed. Through the large window facing the parking lot, members of the public had begun gathering, drawn by rumor, by live alerts, by the breathless murmur of something important finally cracking open. Most expected press conferences. Some expected violence. No one expected silence, and yet here it was. They didn't see Taylor, they didn't need to. What they saw was the man left behind, standing under the fluorescent glare, shoulders squared, hand resting gently over the badge he had just recovered. It was a moment unannounced and uninterrupted. It was what the country had long forgotten. A man who didn't raise his voice because his posture had already spoken. One woman near the front raised her phone, but didn't press record. She lowered it slowly, overcome by something older than content. Behind her, a child on tiptoe whispered, "Who is he?" Her father didn't answer. He just lifted his hand, fingers to his brow. The salute rippled outward. No one shouted. No one instructed. It happened the way wind lifts ashes. Natural, mournful, final. A ripple of stillness spread across the street like the slow bloom of memory itself. Inside the precinct, the air grew heavier, not with grief but gravity, the kind that made even the most hardened agents slow their breath, as if they had stumbled into hallowed ground, not because they feared punishment but because they recognized integrity, not institutional, personal. The old man didn't blink. He didn't nod. He didn't smile. He turned. His eyes swept over the room, level, searching, unafraid. They didn't accuse. They didn't plead. They observed, measured, judged in a way no courtroom could emulate. And something inside the people who met that gaze shifted. Not guilt, not shame, something closer to reckoning. The FBI officer, still standing at attention, didn't waver. Jed, from the far end of the hallway, stepped out of the shadows. His eyes locked on the insignia, then on the man wearing it. No words were exchanged. None were necessary. What passed between them was older than language, an understanding forged in decades, in conflict, in the quiet aftermaths where real honor revealed itself. The badge on the table was still there. Jed didn't touch it. He simply stood taller. The old man walked past it, the rubber soles of his boots silent on the tile. He reached the doors, large, metallic, automatic, and paused. For one breath, for one echo. The light above caught the edge of his collar, a faint glint of olive and bronze. As the doors opened, the crowd outside parted. Not because someone told them to, but because instinct did. Children stepped back. Adults removed their hats. Even a stray reporter lowered her mic. Not a soul called his name. Not a single word broke the quiet, but the weight of history pressed on every chest. He walked through them, not acknowledged, not ignored, just known. A teenager standing near the curb muttered, "He's the one from that video, right?" But the old woman beside her said, "No, he's the one they didn't film, the one who never needed to be filmed." The rain had stopped. The asphalt still shimmered, a mirror beneath boots. The man walked alone. Not because he was isolated, but because solitude suited symbols better. Behind him, the precinct still hummed with artificial light and unfinished paperwork. But inside it, something fundamental had shifted. A uniform wasn't meant to be worshipped. It was meant to be worn by men who understood what it cost. And here was one who bore it. Not like armor, but like memory. Not for validation, but for legacy. This was not just the aftermath of an arrest. It was the reintroduction of a truth too long buried under policies and cowardice. The uniform means nothing without the man, and some men, just by standing, make even the guilty silence themselves. There would be no speeches, no medals, no press, but from that moment forward, every salute given to that precinct door would carry the imprint of a badge once dropped and silently reclaimed. And every officer who stood inside would know they had seen honor, real honor, walk through hell and not ask for thanks, only to make sure the door stayed open behind him. Even if he never planned to come back through it again, even if no one remembered his name, because symbols don't demand memory, they shape it. The rain had stopped, but its scent lingered, clinging to the fabric of the precinct like smoke after a long battle. The old man didn't look back as he crossed the threshold. The metal doors sighed shut behind him, and the crowd slowly scattered, unsure whether they had witnessed an ending or a beginning. Inside, in a quiet hallway far from the hum of fluorescent lights and the echo of boots, a young FBI agent stood hesitating outside an interview room. She was new, judging by the polish still on her shoes and the tightly folded notepad in her hand. Her name tag read, Agent C. Ramirez. Her eyes betrayed a restlessness that training couldn't iron out. But today she was here not to investigate, not to interrogate, but to ask something far more difficult. She entered the room slowly. The old man sat by the far end of the table, back straight, hands folded neatly in front of him. The room wasn't cold, but it felt like a place where warmth had been replaced by memory. On the table between them was a small black and white photograph, worn, frayed at the edges, but carefully preserved. A boy, early 20s, in uniform. The kind of smile that wasn't cocky, just proud. Ramirez cleared her throat gently, but didn't sit yet. "Sir," she began, her voice even, respectful, "I've been asked to take your statement, not for the investigation, for the Bureau's internal record. The director authorized it herself." The old man didn't move. He let the silence stretch, not to dominate it, but to remind her that time moves differently for men like him. When he finally spoke, it was with a voice that had once commanded platoons and now only needed 5 words to change the air. "I don't need a defense." Ramirez's pen hovered. He looked at the photo. His hand rested beside it, not trembling, just anchored. I need the system to remember. He didn't elaborate. Ramirez wrote each word down slowly, as if afraid the pen might betray their weight. He didn't look at her. His gaze was still fixed on the photo, on the inscription beneath it, etched in faint blue ink, blurred but still readable. Teach him right, even if I won't live to see it. The photo bore a date, May 2009, a corner folded by time, a shadow just behind the boy's shoulder, like he had always stood next to something heavier than his frame. Agent Ramirez finally sat, her spine stiff. Do you want to add anything, sir? For the record? The old man's fingers traced the bottom edge of the picture. He didn't speak immediately. What came next wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't clean. It wasn't delivered for applause. It came like water drawn from a deep stone. He was 21. They said he was too young to train officers. Said he didn't have the weight yet, but he did. He carried it for men twice his age, and when he left, he didn't ask for honors. He asked for accountability. Ramirez wrote not just the words. She captured the pauses, the silences between syllables. She felt, maybe for the first time, what it meant to take down a testimony that wasn't trying to prove anything, just preserve it. The day we buried him, the man continued, I made one promise, not to cry in uniform, not to raise my voice in anger, but to correct the memory. Not for him, for those who come after. His hand finally left the photo. The table seemed colder without it. There will be others like him, too honest, too young, too quiet to be believed. He turned toward Ramirez. Not with demand, but with clarity. Your bureau writes rules. Make sure you also write reminders. She nodded, but it felt insufficient. So she did what she had been trained not to do. She put the pen down. Sir, she asked, this time not on record. Was that badge yours or his? He didn't answer immediately. Then, with a stillness that seemed impossibly heavy, he said, both. He earned it. I kept it. Until someone else was ready. Ramirez didn't ask who he meant, because maybe it wasn't a person, maybe it was a moment, and maybe that moment had just walked past 100 silent salutes and didn't need to say a word. The rest of the statement was short. No dates. No accusations, no request for commendation, just one sentence written as dictated. History does not begin with what is recorded. It begins with what is remembered and what we dare not forget. Agent Ramirez closed the notebook. The room didn't shift. The light didn't brighten, but something in her breathing did. She stood. The old man remained seated, the photo still in front of him. Before leaving, she turned once more and said, Thank you, sir. He looked at her, not kindly, not coldly, just completely, and said nothing. 2 weeks later, that notebook, unmarked, unsigned, labeled only with an internal case code, was circulated in a closed seminar at Quantico, not as evidence, as a curriculum. The file was named Final Testimony 12C. Its subject was never revealed. Its photograph was redacted. But every agent who read it, from probationary cadets to senior instructors, came away with the same question. Who wrote this? And the answer, though never printed, moved like scripture. The last man who didn't need to speak, but made us listen anyway. Some documents are drafted to secure convictions. Others are written to prevent mistakes. But a few, only a few, are written to remind institutions that systems do not have heart. People do. And those hearts break in silence long before policy ever changes. At the bottom of the document, the Bureau quietly added a footer. Memorandum retained for internal ethical review. Not subject to expiration, because some truths age, but this one would not. It would sit on desks, projected in classrooms, whispered between instructors as the moment the Bureau remembered what it meant, not to enforce justice, but to deserve it. The old man never returned to the building. But long after he was gone, his words did. And sometimes late in the halls of training facilities, as cadets reviewed transcripts under dim lights, A single line would stop them cold. I don't need a defense. I need the system to remember. And when that happened, they didn't read further because they knew that was the end of the statement and the beginning of everything else. They didn't know his name. They didn't know the name of his son. But they would pass down the line, word for word, story for story, each new class repeating the same final paragraph of the anonymous transcript. Their voices steady, not reverent, but resolve. They would say it like a doctrine, not from obligation, but from belief, because they had read something not meant to be remembered as a case, but as a compass. And while others chased recognition or avoided blame, this one man had carved a space in the record, not by force, not by outcry, but by remaining still, by speaking few words, by anchoring a truth so firm no storm of opinion could wash it away. His testimony never left that basement room, but its echo became policy, its silence became culture, and every time a recruit stood before a decision, paused in front of a threshold where force tempted louder than principle, it was his sentence, not a command, not a plea, that whispered first. Systems forget. That is their nature. But people choose whether they do. And someone, long ago, had chosen not to let this one be forgotten. Not with headlines, not with medals, but with memory carried like weight on the shoulder and breath in the margin of one final annotated copy, handwritten by a senior instructor who had once heard the man speak. There was a note, scrawled in blue ink, barely visible but unmistakable in tone. This is what a legacy sounds like when it doesn't ask to be called one. The transition from silence to strategy began not with a press conference but with a summons. The memo arrived on a Monday morning, coded Priority Black, authorization traceable to the director's desk, and bearing the title Council Review Directive 9A. No names, no debate, just a location, a time, and one instruction: full audit. By 10:00 a.m., a secure room within the Bureau's northern regional hub had been sealed. The room was sterile by design. White walls, white table, white light, and the agents seated inside wore no rank on their sleeves. This was not a meeting, it was a dissection. 7 screens flickered simultaneously, feeding live telemetry from various precincts, each labeled by alphanumeric codes. But only one was outlined in red: Elridge Township. The small, unassuming town where Taylor had ruled behind a badge now sat at the center of something exponentially larger. An agent stepped forward, tablet in hand. Her voice was precise, clipped, and unflinching. Elridge was not an outlier. It was an anchor, the epicenter of what we now classify as pattern delta violations, localized abuse, scaling to networked corruption. No one interrupted. They weren't here to debate terminology. They were here to confirm what some already suspected and others had long buried. The next slide illuminated the room with quiet brutality, a map of the continental United States, dotted with 7 crimson markers. Each red dot pulsed, representing confirmed breach zones where civil oversight had been compromised by systemic protectionism, false reporting, and collusion between local authorities and administrative shields. Elridge was not only one of them, it was the center spoke of a wheel codenamed Operation Leak Point. A digital overlay detailed years of ignored complaints, redacted reports, and internal memos flagged but never acted on. Taylor's name appeared 5 times, each linked to incidents ranging from unlawful detainment to excessive force with racial bias indicators. All 5 complaints had been logged. All 5 had been marked as resolved without escalation. None had been reviewed by independent internal affairs. Mayor's office, the agent said, her tone colder now, intervened directly on 3 occasions, twice using discretionary budget control as leverage, once issuing an informal blackout on media coverage. A photo appeared next. The mayor, smiling, arm in arm with Taylor at a town hall event 2 years prior. Below the image, a quote pulled from an internal memo. Chief Taylor has our complete confidence. Any criticism is politically motivated noise. The room didn't gasp. They processed. Silence was sharper than outrage. The data continued to stream. 10 seconds, body cam gaps, camera loops, radio logs that had been manually edited with time mismatches as subtle as 3 seconds, enough to distort accountability but not trigger alarms. A forensic audit had caught it, barely. Then came the map again, this time overlaid with social indicators. Demographic suppression, misallocation of federal de-escalation funds, and grant rejections post-civilian complaints. The conclusion was unambiguous. Elridge wasn't just complicit, it was practiced, coordinated, institutional. A younger agent, previously silent, finally leaned forward. So, we're not talking about misconduct. We're talking about architecture. No one nodded, but the acknowledgement was felt. The Bureau didn't deal in metaphors today. The moderator switched screens, now displaying internal comm logs between station heads across the 7 zones. Phrases like, delay the form, code red hold, and wait for optics to cool, repeated in chilling frequency. Taylor's language appeared again, his phrasing of asset insulation and civilian behavior compliance now decrypted as policy-level euphemisms for suppressing whistleblowers and targeting ethnic minorities for routine stop-and-check operations under the guise of public safety. A final slide appeared, Operation Leak Point, status, triggered. At the base of the screen, a schematic of interconnected precincts all routing incident reports through the same encrypted shadow server, located, as confirmed by Trace, inside Elridge's municipal IT department. Someone had built a back door into truth, and now that door had been kicked open. We believe, the lead investigator said flatly, that Taylor's public downfall was not a failure of containment. It was bait. That changed the oxygen in the room. Bait, someone asked. Not sarcastically, but surgically. Correct. His behavior was left unchecked long enough to trace its protections. He was monitored, not stopped, because his collapse would collapse the umbrella. They let that settle. Another agent added, the old man wasn't the target. He was the lever. Silence returned. But it wasn't hollow. It was full of calculation. Someone was already drafting subpoenas. Someone else was already allocating field teams to the remaining 6 zones. No dramatics, no press kits, just operations. Because this wasn't about Taylor anymore. It was about what allowed him. The map stayed on screen. Red pulses slow, deliberate, beating like a synthetic heart. Then the command came, initiate phase 2, and the white room went darker than any courtroom ever would. The white room went darker than any courtroom ever would, but outside its walls, in places untouched by subpoenas and sealed reports, something subtler was moving. Something without an announcement, without a signature, without volume. The first letter arrived on a plain sheet of paper, handwritten in firm strokes that didn't shake. It came from a woman named Clarissa J. Holden, age 74, retired nurse, mother of 2, widow of Sergeant Marcus Holden, who had died in Vietnam. She addressed it not to any director or department, but simply to whomever was watching when he stood alone. The letter began with 7 words, "Thank you for not letting him suffer alone." It didn't explain who he was. It didn't need to. She continued, detailing the day she saw the video. How she paused her breathing when the cuffs locked around a man whose silence told her more about strength than any medal ever had, and how, for the first time since her husband's funeral, she cried not because someone had been wronged, but because someone had endured and others had finally noticed. Her letter ended without a closing. No, sincerely. No, respectfully. Just space. As if she knew the words didn't need wrapping. The Bureau logged the letter, but no one assigned it a case file. Instead, it was pinned, unofficially, quietly, to a bulletin board inside the Bureau's Internal Ethics Division, where agents stopped to read it more than once, some staring longer at the empty closing than the body itself. 2 days later, another envelope arrived, and then 5 more, and then 32, not all from elderly citizens. Some came from veterans, some nurses, some are from children. One letter included a sketch, crude, drawn in blue ink, of the man standing in the precinct doorway with the badge in his hand. Below it, a child had written, "He looked like someone who could lift a mountain, but didn't need to." that the impact spread without orchestration, no campaign, no hashtags, but in forums for military retirees, threads began to emerge. Stories were shared about being pulled over in uniform and called boy, about being asked whether their medals were real, about funerals conducted in silence because no one wanted to talk about the color of the man in the casket. They didn't ask for justice, they didn't ask for noise, they simply told their stories now, because one man had made silence a weapon for memory instead of erasure. In a small church outside Baton Rouge, a photo was hung, not framed, not even nailed, just pinned to a bulletin board with a thumbtack. Among other black and white photos of war heroes, fallen medics, and unnamed service members buried under numbered headstones. His picture didn't list his name, it just had a note scribbled in pen beneath it. He reminded us we're not invisible. The Bureau never responded publicly, but internally, the image of the old man standing straight with cuffs on his wrists and defiance in his spine became part of a new initiative launched quietly and without fanfare. Respect before rank. It was not a campaign meant to rehabilitate the Bureau's image. It was a recalibration, launched with minimal marketing but maximum penetration into the field. In precinct training rooms, on the back wall where once hung charts of de-escalation policy and legal compliance codes, now hung a still of the man during the moment of his arrest. Not because he resisted, but because he didn't. Because his stillness spoke louder than protest. New cadets were shown the video clip not as an example of criminal processing, but as a litmus test for moral instinct. The instructor didn't pause it, didn't add commentary. The silence during the moment when the cuffs clicked was allowed to hang in the room like smoke. What followed was not debate, but reflection. Some agents stared. Some lowered their eyes. One removed his cap. The program's internal documents referred to it as a mirror test. What do you see? Not who, what. In time, the campaign material made its way to recruiting offices, adapted into simple posters. One bore no slogans, just a black field with the image of his back, the badge in his hand, and a single line at the bottom. Stillness is not weakness. And still, the man himself said nothing. He never appeared at any hearing. He never signed any interview releases. He never claimed to speak for anyone. But the silence he left behind kept traveling, kept unfolding, kept bending back the edges of systems that had long grown used to speaking over people like him. A young officer in Portland wrote in a journal entry leaked online, "I sat in the room when they showed the clip. I kept waiting for someone to say he was a threat. No one did. But the part that broke me wasn't the cuffs. It was that he didn't flinch, like he'd already endured worse, like this wasn't new. There was no monument built, no award given. But inside the Bureau's quietest corridors, one small internal committee started to gather stories, testimonials, and correspondence, none of which would be made public. It was labeled echo files, not evidence, not policy, just proof that something had been felt, something had cracked, and something finally was listening. Because there are moments in a system when consequences speak, when reports circulate, when maps light up with red flags, and operations unfold in boardrooms. But there are other moments, softer and slower, where change does not arrive with orders or banners, but with a letter, a sketch, a photo on a corkboard, or the sound of nothing at all except one man standing, letting the weight of a nation's negligence rest silently on his shoulders, refusing to bend, refusing to retaliate, refusing to scream, because the system had already heard too much noise and not enough meaning. That was his answer. Not a speech, not a plea, just the stillness of a man who understood that dignity doesn't shout, it waits, and it echoes. That was his answer. Not a speech, not a plea, just the stillness of a man who understood that dignity doesn't shout, it waits, and it echoes. But for Jed Carson, the echo didn't fade, it followed. It threaded itself into his stride, into the hollow space between badge and conscience, until even the silence felt loud. The precinct was quieter now, stripped of pretense, but Jed heard everything more clearly, not in the chatter of agents or the buzz of fax machines, but in the memory of things unsaid, the way he'd looked away when Taylor barked at that woman, the way he'd justified procedural shortcuts as just getting through the shift, the way he'd treated silence like a shield when it had been a sentence. He sat at his desk the following morning, alone, the blinds drawn, the coffee untouched. In front of him, one sheet of paper, no letterhead, no header, just one sentence written in his own tight, unforgiving handwriting. I stayed silent at the wrong time. He folded it once, placed it on top of his service file, and walked into the captain's office without a word. No exit interview, no request for commendation, no explanation. Some departures arrived like protests. He arrived like gravity. As he exited the building, Jed paused at his locker one last time. Inside, a few things remained: a half-worn pair of boots, a yellowing citation, and a battered metal lighter, the kind you didn't buy but earned. He took the lighter, turned it in his hand, and remembered the man who had given it to him decades ago, not during war but after it, in a makeshift medic tent in Kandahar, when silence between gunfire meant survival, and gestures spoke louder than orders. The old man hadn't said much then either. He had handed him the lighter and said, "If you ever forget who you are, strike this. It'll remind you who lit the way." Jed had kept it all these years, never used it. Not once. He placed it on the locker shelf and closed the door softly, as if sealing away a version of himself that had taken too long to look up. He didn't call a cab. He didn't drive. He walked past the precinct, past the courthouse, past the cafes where officers still sat with their backs to the window, until he reached the edge of town. The old neighborhood, the small brick house with the trimmed hedges and the porch that hadn't changed in 20 years. Jed didn't knock. He didn't want a conversation. He didn't expect forgiveness. He placed a small wooden box on the porch. Inside it was a silver star, old, authentic, and engraved. Not with his name, but a service number that belonged to a soldier long buried. He had kept it for decades, tucked in a drawer marked "in case," but there had never been the right case. Until now. He turned, took 2 steps back, and gave the house a single, firm salute. Not stiff, not theatrical, just complete. Then he walked away. No one saw him. No one called after him. And that was exactly how it should have been. Jed didn't disappear. He just stepped out of a role that had outlived its purpose. He wasn't looking for redemption. He wasn't offering confession. He was, for once, letting his actions carry the weight his silence never could. Because not every man is a villain, and not every man becomes a hero. Some just wake up one morning, look at what they've become, and decide they'd rather be someone else, even if no one sees it. Back at the precinct, the resignation letter sat on the desk, unsigned by any superior, untouched by HR. The lighter remained in the locker for 3 days before someone opened it and struck the flint. The flame burned blue for a second, then faded. But in that second, something changed. And in a system too used to noise, Jed's final gesture landed like a verdict. No longer complicit, not forgiven, but finally facing the direction he should have been facing all along. And in a system too used to noise, Jed's final gesture landed like a verdict. No longer complicit, not forgiven, but finally facing the direction he should have been facing all along. The day of the trial arrived without fanfare, but not without weight. Federal Courthouse, Southern District. Clean marble, sharper silence. A single clip would lead the charge, a mere 16 seconds of footage now engraved into the country's subconscious, broadcast without commentary, without anchor narration, just a sequence. A baton raised, a voice shouting, a cry muffled, a hand reaching to protect. Taylor's voice was audible, commanding, cruel, and procedural in the worst sense of the word. The moment the video ended, no one in the courtroom spoke. Not the judge, not the audience. The silence didn't request understanding, it demanded reckoning. Taylor sat in a pressed suit 2 shades too dark, jaw clenched, eyes darting across a room he could no longer command. He looked smaller under the fluorescent light, less a figure of authority than a man stripped of scaffolding. When the prosecution rose, the room stiffened. A figure walked toward the podium, A woman in a gray suit, no jewelry, no makeup flourish, just presence. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't need to. Taylor recognized her instantly. Alicia Browning, former Army captain, former JAG attorney, former medic attached to the same forward base where Taylor once played soldier, in a command chair miles from the actual dirt. She stood, hand firm on the edge of the bench, voice low but unmistakably surgical. "I served with him," she said, "not beside him, with him." And even then his rank outran his judgment. Taylor leaned forward, scoffing. "I followed protocol. Everything I did was within authorized limits." Browning didn't raise her voice. She raised the room's clarity instead. Following contempt is not following procedure. Abusing uniformity isn't enforcing the law. You didn't act by the book. You rewrote the book to match your disdain. The judge said nothing. He didn't need to. The courtroom had already decided. The next hour unfolded not as a battle of proof, but as a dissection of motive. Exhibit after exhibit laid bare the embedded patterns, the doctored logs, the mirrored testimonies, the repeated victims of identical abuse cycles. Taylor tried to laugh, tried to posture, tried to summon the swagger he once wore like a second uniform. But each line of defense cracked under the weight, not of accusation, but of repetition. He hadn't been caught, he had been recorded. When asked for a statement before sentencing, Taylor stood. His voice rose, not with regret, but defiance. "I did what I was trained to do. I maintained order. I enforced compliance. If that's a crime, then maybe you should be charging the system, not me." From the gallery, someone shifted, then stood. Alicia Browning again, permission granted with a nod. She approached the well, slow, unshaken. "We are," she said. "That's why you're first." Taylor opened his mouth, but the judge lifted a hand. "Enough." The verdict came crisp, clear, absolute. 8 years of federal prison. No parole. Immediate revocation of all licensure, stripped of security clearance, barred from any future position involving law enforcement, armed security, or municipal leadership, permanently. Taylor blinked, not because of the years, but because of the silence that followed. No one cheered, no one wept, no one reacted as if a monster had been caged. Because it wasn't about caging, it was about declaring with finality that dishonor in uniform is not a footnote, it's a rupture, and ruptures need closure. As marshals cuffed him, Taylor's eyes scanned the gallery, desperate for recognition, for outrage, for someone, anyone, to believe he had simply been a man caught in a changing world. But what he saw instead were rows of faces, no longer afraid, no longer beneath him, no longer impressed. He muttered again, lower now, to the floor more than to the room. "I did what they told me to." And somewhere behind him, Alicia whispered back, "Not to wound, not to win, but to end. But you enjoyed it." And that was the part the system could never unsee. And that was the part the system could never unsee. But what followed was not an ending, it was ignition. By the time Taylor was led from the courtroom, cuffed wrists pulled tight against the last of his vanishing arrogance, the outside world had already begun to answer in ways he could neither predict nor prevent. That afternoon, the courthouse steps filled, not with chants, not with protests, but with presents. Dozens at first, then hundreds. Elderly veterans in worn caps and pressed slacks. Women with ribbons from 3 wars pinned beside photographs. Children on the shoulders of parents who had once served and been forgotten. They carried nothing that burned, nothing that shouted, just small black pins on their collars, jackets, sleeves. The pins read, "Still standing." It had started as a quiet gesture, a digital emblem uploaded to a forgotten forum, just a single image of the man in cuffs, eyes forward, spine unbent. But it traveled like memory. One download became 20, 20 became thousands. By the end of the week, orders came from 5 continents, because it wasn't just one man in those cuffs. It was every man and woman who had been decorated and discarded, obeyed and overlooked, saluted in ceremony but dismissed in silence. Inside the courtroom, the judge returned to chambers. Alicia packed her files. But outside, the streets told a different story. There were no speeches, there were no slogans, but there were symbols, and symbols endure longer than verdicts. In a corner of the square, a boy, no older than 7, stood clutching a drawing. Crayon on notebook paper, a figure in a military coat, hands behind his back. Shadow stretching across the ground. Underneath, 3 words, written in shaky block letters. I want to be him. When asked by a reporter who he meant, the boy pointed to the poster behind him. A massive print, mounted across scaffolding, stretched across 20 feet of brick wall. The image was unmistakable. The old man, seated, hands cuffed, head lifted, not in defiance, but in permanence. Underneath, in all caps, just 2 words, we remember. The Bureau did not sponsor it, the government did not approve it, but no one removed it, because you cannot legislate reverence. You cannot redact truth once it has a face. Within days, similar gatherings appeared in other cities. Houston, Minneapolis, Detroit, Seattle, Atlanta. Each one different in accent, background, uniform, but all bound by a single acknowledgement. This was not just about what had happened in one courtroom. This was about what had been permitted to happen everywhere else. A sergeant from the Gulf War, previously unknown to public record, gave a 1-minute statement outside a county courthouse. We didn't come here because we're angry. We came because we're done pretending it was isolated. We came because he didn't flinch, and neither will we. No movement claimed ownership. No party planted its banner. It was too human for that. Too quiet. Too inconveniently true. In coffee shops, the lighter from Jed's locker became a story passed between veterans who had stopped talking about the old days. Now they did. In classrooms, teachers played the clip, not for violence, but for context. They asked students what they saw, not what they were told to see. The answers varied, but one theme emerged again and again. He didn't shout, he didn't break, he didn't ask for anything. And somehow, that asked for everything. At the National Cemetery, a small plaque appeared, unofficial and unannounced, tucked beneath a line of forgotten markers. Carved into the steel, not all medals are worn. Some are carried in silence. And beside it, nailed into the soil, a still-standing pin, weathered by rain but not rusted. Even within precincts, training academies, and security agencies, the ripple touched ground. Recruits were handed not just manuals, but moments. In one classroom in Quantico, a final exam was replaced by a single prompt. What would you have done in the room when he stood with the badge in his hand? There were no correct answers, only revealing ones, because it had never been about one man. It had never been about Taylor. It had never even been about the video. It was about the echo that truth makes when finally given space, about the shape of accountability when it's no longer a punishment, but a promise. They never learned the old man's name. Not fully. He didn't give interviews. He didn't pose for documentaries. He didn't attend the ceremonies. But his face, cuffed and calm, made its way into the heart of a culture exhausted by false bravado and starving for something real. One veteran in New York was asked why he wore the still-standing badge every day. He replied, "Because I don't want my grandchildren to think we only stood for ourselves." No one needed permission to remember. They just needed someone to make it possible. And one man did, without asking, without speech, without even standing. He just refused to bow. He just refused to bow. And when a man refuses to bow, systems eventually bend. Not out of fear, out of exposure. Because once a single fracture is illuminated, no structure, matter how fortified, can pretend to be whole. 3 days after the image of the old man cuffed, yet unbroken, became a national emblem, the Federal Bureau of Investigation stated in the director's office, Operation Sand Vow is complete. All 7 law enforcement agencies identified under Pattern Delta have been placed under federal scrutiny. Multiple leadership suspensions are active, and further investigations are ongoing. The language was cold, precise, and bureaucratic. But what it lacked in poetry, it made up for in weight. This was not symbolic reform, This was a systematic excavation. Simultaneously, the Department of Justice launched a retroactive audit across the Tri-County region, targeting all recorded arrests between 2012 and 2022. Civil rights teams, external reviewers, forensic analysts, none of them dressed in press conference smiles, began combing through every intake file, missing body cam timestamp and prosecution that hinged on reports authored by the now indicted precincts. The task wasn't a repetition, it was a record correction. In less than a month, 26 convictions were frozen, 11 cases reopened, 4 wrongful imprisonments overturned. The system, in its long slumber of plausible deniability, had been roused, not by outrage, not by a riot, but by a man who sat in silence and let a cuffed wrist speak louder than institutional denial. In parallel, the Office of Veterans Affairs, under mounting public and legislative pressure, convened a bipartisan panel to address historic misconduct toward decorated minority veterans, especially those from eras where segregation and silence walked in tandem. The result wasn't a commission, it was a reckoning. A new National Honor Review Board was established, tasked not with fabricating statues, but with auditing names already carved into them. And then came the invitation. The letter was formal, gilded border, signature from 3 federal departments, a request for the man whose photo had become a watermark for moral clarity to attend a ceremony in Washington, D.C. The note offered him a seat at the dais, a full military escort, and the unveiling of a new honor roll for those who had been overlooked, silenced, or erased due to administrative bias or cultural expedient. It was, on paper, the highest civilian military honor one could receive without dying for it. He declined. The response arrived by mail. No return address. The handwriting, sharp but steady. I didn't do this to be remembered. I did it so others wouldn't be forgotten. And beneath that, one more line. Less refusal than reminder. Erase the names of those who never knew what war tasted like, and stop calling them brave. He didn't want a title, he wanted the truth. The panel was stunned. Accolades were suspended. The honor board, shaken by the clarity of his reply, pivoted. Instead of adding his name to a list, they began removing others. An internal review uncovered over 40 commendations issued to administrative officers who had never deployed, yet used policy papers to sideline combat-tested veterans of color. Quietly, those commendations were revoked. No press release, just a series of memos marked reclassified in a single directive from the review chair. Valor is not a theory. The system had spoken before, through verdicts, through loopholes, through silence. But now, reluctantly, it began to listen, because systems, for all their mass, are still moved by small hinges, and the old man had become one. He returned to his modest home, the lawn still trimmed, the porch unchanged. Neighbors passed by and waved differently now, not with pity or politeness, but with recognition, not of celebrity, but of certainty. He spoke to none of them, but when one child holding a history assignment asked what a veteran was supposed to do when the system got it wrong, the man didn't lecture. He pointed to the cuff-shaped imprint on his wrist and said only, "Stay still until they see it." No medal could add weight to that. No ceremony could encapsulate it. Because in the end, he didn't win, he didn't conquer, he didn't become a martyr or a saint. He just made the system acknowledge itself. And in a country built on memory and myth, that alone was revolutionary. The final image the Bureau released as part of its transparency initiative was not of him, it was of a conference table, empty, white, with one chair turned slightly away from the rest. On the seat, a folded note. The only thing visible in the photo, a single line, handwritten in all caps. They weren't all wrong, but they let it be. And that was the phrase etched into memory, even as the system adjusted, retreated, shifted under the weight of its reflection. But for one town, Elridge, the reckoning did not end with policy or press. It ended with removal. not of person, of pretense. The local precinct, once a monument to silence dressed as order, stood quietly one morning under a low gray sky as maintenance workers arrived with instructions they hadn't received before. No audience, no announcement. Just a scissor lift, a crowbar, and a plaque. Mounted above the front entrance in clean brass was the long-standing plate. Honor Wall, Distinguished Service, Elridge Peedy. Beneath it, 21 names. Among them, in bold serif typeface, Captain Matthew J. Taylor. But now the seal around the plate had been cracked. The bolts loosened. The plaque was removed. Not dramatically, not ceremoniously, just lifted away like a painting that no longer belonged in the gallery. As it was lowered into the bed of a truck, a cleaner, colder sign was mounted in its place, temporarily under review, federal custody. Later that week, a new plate returned, not a new wall. The same slab of steel mounted back in place, only different. Every name preserved, except one, Taylor's. His name had not been replaced, not rewritten, not even redacted. It had been scored through with a single horizontal line, deep and unforgiving, like a wound that chose not to heal. No words above, no footnotes below. Just silence and a mark. And the town came, not in protest, not with signs or speeches. They came like mourners at a grave that held no body. They stood before the wall, families who had long stopped trusting what uniforms meant, veterans who had memorized procedures more than names, children who didn't fully understand what had happened but knew they had seen something adults were too late to see. One woman took a photo of the plaque, not for celebration, but preservation. A boy beside her asked if he could touch the line. She nodded. His finger traced the groove where a name used to mean pride. Now it meant a pause. By noon, more had gathered, quietly, deliberately. The space before the wall became a moment rather than a place. No cameras rolled, no local officials made statements, and then a little girl, 7, maybe 8, stood at the edge of the group, looked up and whispered to her mother, loud enough for a few nearby to hear, "If that name was wrong, why don't they just take the whole thing down?" Her mother, eyes fixed on the scarred steel, answered without hesitation, "Because some things shouldn't be erased. They should be remembered for what not to become." That was the difference. No longer were wrongs hidden under varnish. They were etched in plain sight, not for shame, for instruction. Weeks passed, and the wall remained. Schools brought students in quiet groups. No field trip banners, just observation. One local teacher asked her class what the line meant. One girl replied, "It means someone lied loud enough to be honored, until someone quiet told the truth." In time, the plaque took on a life of its own, not as tribute, but as caution. Visitors from other towns came to see it. Some scoffed, some wept, but most simply stared, because there is something arresting about a name being present and absent at the same time. It says more than removal ever could. Inside the station, now under interim federal oversight, new recruits were instructed to pass the wall every morning and pause, not to recite, not to salute, just to look, a ritual of restraint, a moment of mandated acknowledgement. The directive was clear: remember what we thought we knew and why we no longer believe it. And far away, in the same modest house with the same unchanged porch, the old man heard nothing of this. He didn't need to. He knew the system had finally answered, not with apology, not with grandeur, but with a scratch deep enough to last longer than gold. The name had not been erased. It had been crossed out, and that made all the difference. The name had not been erased, it had been crossed out, and that made all the difference. But not for him. For him, difference had never been a line on a wall. It was a decision in silence, a refusal to bend when the weight came down, a choice to remain still in a world that rewarded motion without meaning. So, when the press came, eventually, predictably, hungrily, he did not hide, he did not lock his gate or deny questions. He simply stepped outside onto the porch, as he had every morning for decades, the same cup of dark coffee in his hand, the same scuffed boots, The same gaze that made younger men check their posture without knowing why. A reporter stood across the sidewalk, microphone lowered, hesitant, as if unsure whether history would speak in complete sentences. "Do you want your honor restored, sir?" she asked, not challengingly, but as if expecting pain. He looked at her like a man asking if he wanted back what had never left him. "I never lost it," he said, calmly, without pride, as if reciting the temperature or announcing the time of day, and that was the end of the interview. The footage aired, but no one replayed it for drama, because there was nothing dramatic about a man telling the truth. It simply sat there, undeniable, like a mountain never noticed until the wind changes. The screen didn't blink. The audio didn't tremble. The nation paused, collectively, in the face of someone who had no reason to raise his voice, because the weight of what he had lived through did all the speaking for him, wordlessly. Later that week, a boy, freckled, missing a tooth, maybe 9, broke from a crowd gathered in the town square. He walked up to the old man, hands trembling but determined, and pressed a folded sheet into his palm. It was a black and white printout of the now Taconic image. The old man in handcuffs, chin lifted, eyes level, posture not defiant, but immovable. Below the image, written in pencil, the boy had scrawled, "Thank you for staying still. I want to do that too." The man didn't speak. He didn't kneel. He didn't soften. He simply nodded. Once. The kind of nod that didn't seek to teach, only to confirm what was already understood by those who paid attention. He turned and kept walking. The crowd didn't part like they did for heroes. They didn't cheer like they did for martyrs, but they moved aside, not because they had to, because they knew how to. And as he passed through them, no escort, no spotlight, no medal, every head turned, not in awe, not in fear, but in reverence for something even older than authority. Earned stillness. Some people fight to be heard. Others wait long enough to become unavoidable. That afternoon, inside the FBI's national headquarters, a private leadership summit concluded. No cameras, no statements. Only one screen remained active as agents filed out, and on that screen, as the final slide of the internal debrief faded to black, a single sentence appeared in white-black letters, not attributed to anyone, not explained, but final in tone and truth. Honor does not need to be returned. It just needs to be left untouched. No one clapped. No one spoke. They just stood, as if trying to measure their spine against the quiet outline of a man who had never asked for vindication, never accepted defeat, and never surrendered his name to anyone, not even history. He was not the hero of the story. He was the proof that it had happened, and that was enough, because the man who wanted nothing could never have it taken away, and the world at long last had remembered how to listen, and that too made all the difference. Before you go, take a moment to breathe in what this story stands for. Not just the silence of one man, but the echoes he awakened. Stories like this don't thrive on algorithms. They live because someone out there, someone like you, feels seen, understood, challenged. If this story moved you, made you pause, reminded you of something you've carried quietly for years, speak up in the comments. Share your truth. Whether you're a veteran, a mother, a teacher, a kid drawing strength from someone who never asked to be noticed, your voice belongs here. Your experience, your reflection, your perspective, they all matter. Hit that like button, not for metrics, but as a sign that you're part of a community that values substance over noise. Share this with someone who needs to remember that integrity doesn't vanish, even when recognition does. Subscribe to the channel, not because it's expected, but because this is just one of many stories we'll tell. Stories that pierce through the surface and reach for something higher. Your support gives us the reason and the responsibility to keep telling them. Together, we're not just watching a video. We're restoring dignity, one still moment at a time. And in this space, that means everything.